I bought the lake in 2019. Not the shoreline, not the access rights. The lake itself, the lake bed, the water column, the riparian buffer. The title is 14 pages. Page 4 says one thing clearly. Shoreline owners have non-commercial access, nothing more. No commercial use, no fee-based activities, no structures on the lake bed, not without my written consent. I left for a 14-month federal contract in Alaska in August 2023. While I was gone, the HOA president built a resort, 199 vacation rental cabins, a lodge. A commercial boat launch poured into my lake bed. A 340-foot floating dock anchored with 44 steel pins driven into my lakebed substrate. All of it marketed on lake access at $285 a night. He never called me. 3 board members had asked him to. One resigned when he wouldn't answer. The question, "Who owns the lake? Have you contacted them?" was asked twice, voted on, recorded in the minutes, and ignored. He assumed lake access meant lake ownership. I returned from Alaska in October, stood on my western shore, and counted the rooftops. Then I called my water rights attorney. 14 months later, $24.09 million settlement. 44 steel pins pulled from my lake bed. Lake access removed from the resort's booking listings, per court order. 199 cabins in the woods. He never read page 4. Before we dive into the story, comment where you're watching from, and make sure you're subscribed for more stories like this. Dana's first call had come on a Tuesday evening in late September. I was at the Bureau of Reclamation field office in Anchorage, 14 months into a federal water resource management contract on the Susitna River Basin, the kind of work that keeps you in the field 6 days a week and leaves you with your phone on silent most of the time. The contract was important, the timeline was compressed, and Dana and I had agreed before I left that she would manage the Lake Harrow property through the duration, handle anything routine, and call me for anything that wasn't. She had called 3 times in the previous 3 weeks. I had called her back each time, and she had described what was happening in terms that I had, incorrectly as it turned out, processed as the usual friction. We own the only non-HOA parcel in the Lake Harrow watershed. The Lakewood Ridge Community Association had owned the eastern and northern shoreline since the development was built in the early 2000s. 340 acres of residential lots, backing up to the lake, all of them carrying riparian access rights to the water, all of them in an HOA that had historically been a standard residential association. Lawn maintenance standards, architectural review, gate access management. The friction that came with owning the lake in a watershed full of people who wanted to use it was not new. HOA letters about dock permits we didn't need their permission for, complaints about the riparian buffer boundary markers that the county surveyor had placed and that some homeowners treated as suggestions. A running, low-level tension between the association's sense that the lake was a community amenity and the deed that said otherwise. I had assumed Dana's calls were more of that. They were not more of that. I drove the Susitna access road back to the field office on the morning of October 12th, cleared my equipment, filed my final project documentation, and boarded the Anchorage to Charlotte flight with a layover in Seattle. 14 months. I had been gone long enough that the Carolina light through the descent window looked unfamiliar for a moment before it settled back into recognition. Dana met me at the gate. She did not say anything immediately. She handed me a coffee, took my bag, and walked me to the car. We were on I-85 southbound before she spoke. "I need you to see it before I tell you how bad it is," she said. "Because if I tell you first, you'll try to process it before you've seen it, and you won't process it correctly." I looked at her. "That bad?" "Nate," she said, "just wait until you see it." The access road to Lake Harrow turns off the county highway 4 miles south of the Lakewood Ridge development entrance. It runs 3 miles through second-growth hardwood, a gravel track, single lane, the same road it had been when the original landowner used it to reach the lakeshore before the development went in. Our road, private, gated, titled with the property. I drove it the way I had driven it 100 times. The familiar sequence of curbs, the creek crossing at the 2-mile mark, the final long straight where the hardwood's thin and the lake begins to appear through the tree line. The lake appeared through the tree line, and behind it, on the eastern and northern shores, the HOA's side, the 340 acres of residential shoreline that I had owned the water rights to, and they had owned the land above, something that had not been there 14 months ago. I stopped the truck. Cabins. Not a cabin, not a cluster, a development. Identical prefabricated units in a continuous line along the eastern shore, each one set back from the water by approximately 30 feet, each one with a small deck facing the lake. I counted the visible units on the eastern shore, before the shoreline curved north and I lost the sight line. 47 from this angle alone. A paved loop road ran behind them, connecting all of them to a central structure, a lodge building, 2 stories, with a parking lot. At the eastern shore, at the end of a spur road off the loop, a concrete boat launch extended into the water, into my lake bed. A sign at the lodge entrance, visible from where I sat in the truck on the access road, in the same stone face and bronze letter style as the Lakewood Ridge Monument sign at the development's main entrance. Harrow Lake Retreat, a Lakewood Ridge community experience. I sat in the truck for a full minute. Then I got out, walked to the water's edge, and stood there. The lake was the same lake. The water quality looked maintained. I would check that later, methodically, but the surface clarity from the western shore appeared normal. The shoreline on my side, the western shore, our shore, was untouched, the riparian buffer intact, the waterline where it had always been. The eastern shore was unrecognizable. I counted the units from the water's edge, working north along the visible shoreline. The curve of the lake hid the northern shore from my position. I counted 68 before the curve took the rest. Dana had said 199. I walked back to the truck and opened the folder I had carried from Anchorage in my laptop bag. The folder I bring to the Lake Harrow property every visit. The one that contains the deed, the riparian rights instrument, the county survey, and the land trust documentation. The same folder I had been carrying since we closed on the property in 2019. I opened to the riparian rights instrument. 14 pages, recorded with the county in 1987, when the original landowner had subdivided the shoreline parcels into what would eventually become the Lakewood Ridge development. 14 pages that described, with the specificity of a document written by someone who understood what they were protecting, exactly what the shoreline parcels could and could not do with access to the lake. I turned to page 4, Section 3, Subsection B. Riparian access rights appurtenant to the Class B shoreline parcels, as described in Exhibit A, shall be limited to non-commercial recreational use of the water surface by parcel owners and their guests. No commercial enterprise, fee-based activity, or revenue-generating use of the water surface, lakebed, or riparian buffer zone shall be permitted under Class B riparian access rights without the express written consent of the lakebed owner of record. Non-commercial. I looked at the lodge, the 199 cabins, the boat launch in my lakebed, the sign, Harrow Lake Retreat, a Lakewood Ridge community experience, a commercial resort built on restricted riparian access rights on a lake that had been titled in my name since 2019, by a man who had apparently never read page 4 of the document that governed what he could do with my water. I called Dana. How long has the lodge been operating? 8 months. They opened in February. The cabins started filling in March. What did the county say when you filed the objection? They said the structures are on HOA land, not the lake. They don't regulate what the HOA does on their own parcels. A pause. Nate, I tried. I filed 3 times. I know you did, I said. The county's right. The structures are on their land. That's not the issue. What's the issue? I looked at the boat launch, the concrete extending into the water, 31 feet, by rough estimate from this distance, into the lake bed. The issue is the lake, I said. The issue is my lake bed. I called Garrison Priel at 6 p.m. I had looked him up on the drive from the access road to our property's main structure, the house on the western shore that Dana had been maintaining in my absence. Garrison Priel, 58, developer, had purchased the controlling interest in the Lakewood Ridge HOA's development company in 2020, 1 year after I had bought the lake, and had been serving as HOA president since 2021. His development background was commercial hospitality, resort properties, vacation rental developments, managed recreational communities. He had looked at Lake Harrow and seen a resort asset. He had not looked at who owned the lake. He answered on the third ring with the ease of someone who handles business calls all day and has a prepared register for new contacts. I gave him my name and property address. I said, "I've just returned from a 14-month federal contract. I'm standing on the western shore of Lake Harrow, looking at 199 vacation cabins on a lake I own. I need you to explain to me the legal basis on which you built a commercial resort on restricted riparian access rights." A pause, the first fraction of a second where the prepared register recalibrated. "Mr. Calloway, I understand you have concerns about the development. The riparian access rights attached to the Lakewood Ridge shoreline parcels authorize lake access and use for the community. The resort infrastructure is entirely on HOA land. The cabins, the lodge, the road system. The boat launch is a minimal infrastructure improvement consistent with the community's riparian access rights. Did you read the riparian rights instrument before you built 199 rental cabins on my lake? My attorney reviewed the applicable. Did you read it?" A longer pause. "My attorney confirmed that the water access rights run with the shoreline parcels and authorize lake use consistent with the community's." Mr. Priel, the riparian rights instrument recorded with this county in 1987 contains a non-commercial use clause on page 4. It uses the phrase non-commercial without qualification. It explicitly prohibits revenue-generating use of the water surface, lake bed, or riparian buffer without the written consent of the lakebed owner. I paused. "I am the lakebed owner. You have not contacted me. You have not requested my consent. You have operated a commercial resort, generating revenue from access to my lake for 8 months. Silence. "Additionally," I said, "the boat launch is a permanent structure on my lakebed. You do not have my permission for that structure. You have never asked for my permission for that structure." Another silence. Longer this time. The silence of someone whose attorney had apparently not read page 4. "I'd want to have my attorney review the instrument you're referencing before." "Have your attorney call mine by Monday," I said. "Her name is Elena Marsh. Priya will have her contact information to you by morning." I ended the call. I stood on the western shore of Lake Harrow for a while after that. The last light going off the water. The lodge lights coming on across the lake, warm and golden. The cabins lit up along the eastern shore, occupied most of them. Guests who had booked a lakefront retreat and were paying $285 a night for access to a lake that belonged to someone who had never been asked. I called Elena Marsh at 7 p.m. She was a water rights attorney in Raleigh. She had helped me structure the original land trust purchase in 2019 and had been on retainer since. She knew the Lake Harrow riparian rights instrument the way I knew it, by section number, by clause, by the specific language on page 4 that made what Garrison Priel had built not an ambitious development project, but a 7-figure legal catastrophe. She answered. "Elena," I said, "someone built a commercial resort on my lake." A pause. "Tell me everything," she said. I told her everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, the quiet of an attorney processing a case file, sorting the elements, arranging the sequence. "Nate, the boat launch, how far does it extend into the lake?" 30 feet, by rough estimate, concrete, embedded in the lake bed. "That's lakebed trespass. That's not a riparian rights question. That's a direct encroachment on titled private property." "I know." "And the non-commercial clause, he's been operating for 8 months. February through now," Dana confirmed. 8 months of commercial revenue generated from access to your lake under restricted riparian rights. She paused. "How many cabins?" 199. Another pause. Longer. "Nate," she said, "pull the reservation data if you can get it. I want to know what 8 months of 199 cabins at lakefront rates looks like in dollar terms before I file anything." "I have their marketing materials," I said. $285 a night, 70% occupancy estimated in their promotional documents. She was quiet for a moment. "That's roughly $1 million a month," she said. "I know. And they never called you." I looked at the lodge lights across the water. "They never called me," I said. "Elena called me Monday morning with the full chain of title. She had spent the weekend pulling records, the original 1972 land grant, the 1987 subdivision filing, the 2019 land trust transfer, and every deed, easement, and recorded instrument in between. She had the Lake Harrow parcel history in its complete form, assembled the way you assemble it, when you need to understand not just what the current documents say, but how they came to say it. the decisions made in 1987 by the original landowner that had shaped everything downstream. Start with the 1987 instrument, I said. That's where everything lives, she said. The original landowner, a man named Harold Greer, owned the entire watershed. The lake bed, the surrounding land, all of it. In 1987, he subdivided the eastern and northern shoreline into the parcels that eventually became the Lakewood Ridge development. He sold the shoreline land. He kept the lake. He kept the lake. The lake bed, the water column, the riparian buffer zone, all of it retained in the Greer family trust. When you purchased in 2019, you purchased from the Greer Trust. The shoreline parcels had been sold in 1987 with recorded access rights, the riparian rights instrument, that specified exactly what the shoreline owners could do with the lake they were now adjacent to, but did not own. And Garrison's parcels carry Class B rights. Class B, 14 pages. Harold Greer was, apparently, a careful man. She read me the instrument structure. The Class B designation covered the eastern and northern shoreline parcels, the Lakewood Ridge Development's lake-adjacent lots. Class A rights, by contrast, had been retained by the Greer family for two small western shoreline parcels that had been kept within the trust. Our parcels now, the house and the access road. Class A rights were full riparian rights. Commercial use authorized, structures authorized, unrestricted access. Class B was different in every material respect. Section 2, subsection A, Class B riparian access rights shall include the right of parcel owners and their invited guests to access the water surface of Lake Harrow for non-motorized and light motorized recreational use, including swimming, non-commercial fishing, kayaking, canoeing, and the operation of watercraft with engines not exceeding 25 horsepower. Section 2, subsection B, all Class B riparian access rights are subject to the limitation that such access and use shall be exclusively non-commercial in nature. No commercial enterprise, fee-based activity, or revenue-generating use of the water surface, lake bed, or riparian buffer zone shall be permitted under Class B riparian access rights without the express written consent of the lakebed owner of record, which consent may be withheld at the lakebed owner's sole discretion. Section 3, subsection A. No permanent or semi-permanent structure shall be constructed on the lakebed or within the riparian buffer zone, as defined in Exhibit B, without the express written consent of the lakebed owner of record. Section 3, subsection B. No commercial boat launch facility, commercial dock facility, or fee-based water access infrastructure shall be constructed or operated under Class B riparian access rights. Section 3, subsection C. Water access from Class B parcels shall be limited to natural shoreline ingress. No constructed access infrastructure, including but not limited to paved or graded access ramps, retaining walls, seawalls, or engineered shoreline modifications, shall be installed within the riparian buffer zone or lakebed without the express written consent of the lakebed owner of record. Elena paused after reading Section 3, subsection C. Nate, a poured concrete boat launch is constructed access infrastructure. It is specifically named in the prohibition. I know. Harold Greer anticipated exactly this. He listed it. He wrote, poured or graded access ramps into the instrument in 1987. He knew what shoreline owners would want to build, I said. He'd owned that lake for 30 years before he subdivided it. He knew what he was restricting. And Garrison's attorney reviewed this instrument and told him the water access rights were sufficient. I thought about that for a moment. Either the attorney didn't read it, I said, or he read it and told Garrison what Garrison wanted to hear. Both of those are his problem, Elena said. Let me walk you through the violations. She had built the violations list from the instrument's text against the physical record Dana had documented over the previous 8 months. Photographs, county filing records, the objection submissions Dana had made to the county planning office, and the Harrow Lake Retreat's own marketing materials, which described the resort's amenities in the specific detail of a developer proud of what he'd built. The first violation, commercial operation. Harrow Lake Retreat had been marketing and operating as a commercial vacation rental since February. The resort's website, which Elena had archived in full on Friday evening, described the cabins as offering private lake access, lakefront recreational amenities, and an exclusive Lake Harrow experience. The booking platform listed lake access as a primary amenity in the property descriptions for all 199 units. The lodge offered kayak and canoe rentals, a fee-based water activity, and a guided fishing service operating on the lake. Every revenue-generating activity at Harrow Lake Retreat was predicated on lake access. Lake access that the Class B riparian rights instrument permitted only for non-commercial use. Commercial operation of 199 vacation rental units, marketed on lake access, generating revenue from a lake the HOA did not own, without the consent of the lakebed owner. This was not a borderline reading of the non-commercial clause. It was the clause's exact application. The second violation, the boat launch. Poured concrete, embedded in the lakebed, extending 31 feet from the shoreline into the lake. Section 3, subsection C named it specifically. Section 3, subsection B prohibited commercial launch facilities by category. The launch had been built to serve the resort's commercial guests. It was the primary access point for the kayak rentals and the fishing service. It was a commercial boat launch facility on Nate Calloway's lakebed, built without his knowledge, without his consent, and in direct violation of two separate provisions of the recorded instrument. The third violation, the dock system. Elena had pulled the county records on the floating dock installation. No county permit, no state permit, no lakebed owner consent. The dock system, 22 sections, 340 linear feet of floating platform anchored to the lakebed, with 44 steel pin anchors driven into the lakebed substrate, had been installed in January, 1 month before the resort opened. The pins had penetrated Nate's lakebed 44 times without his permission. The fourth violation, riparian buffer clearing. The riparian buffer zone, as defined in the instrument's Exhibit B, extended 75 feet from the ordinary high water mark along the entire Lake Harrow shoreline. The Harrow Lake Retreat's construction had cleared vegetation, altered grade, and installed impervious surfaces, the loop road, the cabin foundations, the lodge parking lot. Within the buffer zone along approximately 2,100 linear feet of the eastern and northern shoreline. The buffer zone clearing had not been authorized by the county. The county objection Dana had filed had flagged this specifically, and it had not been authorized by the lakebed owner. The fifth violation was the one that changed the nature of the case, the stormwater discharge pipe. An 18-inch diameter corrugated pipe, outlet submerged 4 feet below the water surface on the eastern shore, discharging directly into the lake. No county stormwater permit. No state water quality review. No filtration or treatment system. The pipe had been collecting runoff from the paved loop road, the lodge parking lot, and the graded areas around the cabin foundations, and discharging it, unfiltered, into Lake Harrow for 8 months. Elena had contacted the North Carolina Division of Water Resources on Saturday morning. A lakebed owner in North Carolina holds water quality protection rights in addition to physical ownership rights. The right to maintain the water quality of the owned water body against unauthorized discharge and pollution. An unpermitted discharge pipe emptying into a privately owned lake without the lakebed owner's consent and without a state water quality permit was not a civil matter. It was a state enforcement matter. The Division of Water Resources investigator had called Elena back on Sunday. He told me he'd seen the description and wanted to inspect the outlet before he said anything definitive, Elena told me. But he said, off the record, that an 18-inch pipe discharging construction and parking lot runoff into a private lake for 8 months is going to have a water quality story to tell. What about the dock system? I asked. That's where the state becomes our lever, as well as our ally. A dock system of that size, 340 linear feet, 44 lakebed penetrations, requires a state permit under North Carolina's navigational obstruction statute, regardless of the water body's private ownership status. The permit application requires the written consent of the lakebed owner. She paused. You haven't consented. I haven't been asked. Garrison will need your consent to keep the dock system legally in place. He can't get a permit without it. He's not getting it, I said. I know, that's the point. Garrison's attorney called Elena on Monday at 10:17 a.m., 2 minutes after the opening of the business day, which Elena noted as the response of someone who had spent the weekend reviewing the instrument and had arrived at Monday morning with urgency. His name was Philip Caro, a Charlotte real estate attorney who operated a mid-sized firm with a commercial property practice. Elena knew him by reputation, competent, pragmatic, not a man who would recommend fighting a losing position past the point where the cost of fighting exceeded the cost of settling. His opening position had three components. The riparian rights instrument, he argued, was ambiguous on the commercial use question. The phrase non-commercial use, as applied to a homeowners association's collective lake access, where the association's members were using the lake as part of their residential community experience, not as paying guests of an external commercial enterprise, was subject to reasonable interpretation. The association's members were homeowners. Their use of the lake was residential. The vacation cabins were HOA property. The revenue flowed to the HOA, not to external investors. Elena let him finish. Philip, the instrument uses the phrase revenue-generating use of the water surface, lake bed, or riparian buffer zone. The Harrow Lake Retreat charges $285 per night, per cabin, with lake access as the primary marketed amenity. That is, revenue-generating use of the lake. The entity generating that revenue is the HOA, not an individual homeowner. The instrument doesn't limit the non-commercial clause to individual use. It limits Class B rights categorically. There is no ambiguity. Caro. The boat launch is minimal infrastructure. The instrument specifically names poured or graded access ramps in Section 3, subsection C. The word minimal does not appear in the instrument. The prohibition is categorical. Caro. The dock system is a temporary installation. Elena's response was 3 words. 340 linear feet. She let that sit for a moment. Philip, a temporary dock is a section of floating platform with a removable anchor. What your client installed is a 22-section commercial dock system with 44 steel pins driven into the lakebed substrate. That is not a temporary installation. That is a permanent commercial dock facility, the category that Section 3, subsection B specifically prohibits. Caro was quiet for a moment. What does your client want? My client wants the violations remediated and the damages addressed. I'm giving you 10 days to send me a written remediation proposal. What your client proposes to do about the boat launch, the dock system, the buffer zone clearing, and the stormwater pipe, and on what timeline. Caro. And if we send a proposal? Then we have a starting point for a conversation. If I don't receive a proposal in 10 days, we file. She gave him her filing date, October 28th, and ended the call. The 10 days passed. No proposal arrived. On October 29th, Elena filed. I retained the hydrographic surveyor on October 15th. His name was David Core, a licensed surveyor out of Raleigh, who specialized in water boundary and lakebed work, the specific discipline that sits at the intersection of land surveying and hydrology, and that most general surveyors don't do because it requires equipment and methodology that general land work doesn't demand. I had worked with hydrographic surveyors on 3 Bureau of Reclamation projects. I knew what good lakebed documentation looked like, and I knew that the documentation we were going to produce needed to be precise enough to hold up in a superior court proceeding against a developer with a Charlotte real estate attorney and a financial interest in the outcome. David brought a side-scan sonar unit, a sub-bottom profiler for the lakebed penetration documentation, and a conventional survey team for the riparian buffer work on the shoreline. He spent 4 days on Lake Harrow, 2 on the water, 2 on the eastern and northern shore, and delivered his report on October 24th, 4 days before Elena's filing deadline. I read the report at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening while Dana made coffee, and the lake sat quiet outside the western windows, the October light going early off the water. What David Core found was worse than my rough estimates from the shoreline. The concrete boat launch. My estimate from the access road had been 30 feet. The survey put it at 31 feet, 2 inches from the ordinary high water mark to the launch's submerged toe, the leading edge of the concrete apron embedded in the lakebed substrate. Width at the waterline, 27 feet, 4 inches. The launch flared wider as it extended into the lake, the standard geometry of a boat ramp designed to accommodate multiple vessels. Total lakebed encroachment, 847 square feet of poured concrete on titled private property. To give that number a physical reference, 847 square feet is approximately the footprint of a small house. Garrison had embedded the footprint of a small house in my lakebed without asking. The concrete had been poured in 2 phases. The sub-bottom profiler showed a pore seam at approximately 18 feet from shore, consistent with a construction sequence where the above-water section was poured first and the submerged extension was poured in a second phase at lower water. The launch had been engineered for the specific water depth of Lake Harrow's eastern shore. Someone had measured my lake before they built on it. They had not called me. The floating dock system, 22 individual dock sections, each 8 feet wide and between 16 and 20 feet long, connected in a continuous floating platform along the eastern shore. Total length, 340 linear feet. The configuration ran parallel to the shoreline in the shallow water zone, between the boat launch and the northern shore curve. A commercial dock arrangement, the kind used at marina facilities and resort waterfront operations, not the kind of single dock section a residential homeowner installs for a canoe. The lake bed penetrations, 44 steel helical anchor pins, driven into the lake bed substrate at regular intervals to hold the dock system in position against wind and wave action. The sub-bottom profiler documented each one: diameter, depth, position. The pins had been driven to an average depth of 4.2 feet into my lake bed substrate. 44 penetrations, 4 feet deep each, in lake bed I owned. David noted in the report that helical anchor pins of this type and installation depth are not consistent with temporary dock installation. Temporary dock systems use surface-weighted anchors or shallow-set mushroom anchors that can be retrieved without equipment. Helical pins at 4-foot depth require mechanical extraction. The dock system had been designed and installed for permanent or long-term use. The stormwater discharge pipe. The outlet was located at the northern end of the eastern shore, in a shallow cove where the shoreline curved west. The 18-inch corrugated pipe extended from above the ordinary high water mark, down through the riparian buffer zone and into the lake. Its outlet submerged 4 feet below the water surface at normal lake level. David's team collected water samples at the outlet and at 3 reference points around the lake. Standard water quality sampling protocol for a discharge investigation. He forwarded the samples to the State Environmental Lab on October 21st and noted the preliminary field readings in his report. The field readings at the outlet: elevated turbidity, elevated conductivity, visible discoloration of the water column within approximately 15 feet of the outlet. The pipe had been discharging for 8 months. The discoloration plume was visible to the naked eye in David's survey photographs. The state lab results were not yet back when he filed his report. They would arrive later, and they would say what David's field readings suggested they would say. The riparian buffer clearing. The riparian buffer zone, as defined in the 1987 Instruments Exhibit B, extended 75 feet landward from the ordinary high water mark along the entire Lake Harrow shoreline. Within that 75-foot zone, no impervious surfaces, no grade alteration, no removal of established vegetation without lakebed owner consent. David surveyed the buffer zone along the full 2,100 linear feet of the eastern and northern shoreline affected by the Harrow Lake Retreat construction. What had been inside the buffer zone before construction? Mature hardwood forest, natural shoreline vegetation, the undisturbed soil structure that filters runoff before it reaches the lake. Harold Greer had maintained it for 30 years. The Greer Family Trust had maintained it for another 20. I had maintained it since 2019. What was inside the buffer zone now? The rear foundations of approximately 40 cabin units that had been sited within the 75-foot buffer boundary. The paved loop road, which crossed the buffer boundary at 7 locations. The graded and stabilized slopes connecting the cabin sites to the road. And the discharge pipe, which ran through the buffer zone from the road drainage system to the lake. 2,100 linear feet of shoreline buffer. Stripped, graded, paved, and built on. The loop road encroachment at 7 locations was particularly documented. David had surveyed the buffer boundary against the road center line at each crossing point and produced a table showing the encroachment depth at each location. The deepest encroachment, 34 feet into the buffer zone. The shallowest, 11 feet. All 7 crossings were unpermitted. All 7 were on land where no constructed impervious surface was allowed without consent I had never given. Elena received David's report on October 24th and spent the following day building the financial picture from the documents we had collected. Garrison's marketing materials for Harrow Lake Retreat, archived from the resort website, the booking platform listings, and a glossy printed brochure Dana had obtained from the lodge front desk in September were specific about the financial model. The cabins were listed at $285 per night on the primary booking platform, with weekend premium rates reaching $340. The marketing copy on every cabin listing led with the same amenity: private lake access, kayak and canoe rentals, guided fishing on pristine Lake Harrow. The HOA's own development prospectus, a document Garrison had distributed to Lakewood Ridge homeowners in 2022 when he was seeking board approval for the project, projected 70% average annual occupancy across the 199-unit inventory. At $285 per night, 70% occupancy, 199 units, 365 days, 199 units times $285 times 0.70 times 365 equals $14,434,417.50 per year, $14.4 million annually, generated from commercial use of access to a lake that Garrison Priel did not own, had not purchased, had not leased, had not negotiated any commercial rights to, and had never contacted the owner about. 8 months of operation, February through October. At that rate, approximately $9.6 million in revenue generated from my lake. I had received none of it. I had been asked for none of it. I had not been contacted at any point during the planning phase, the permitting phase, the construction phase, or the 8 months of commercial operation. The first contact Garrison Priel had made with me was the phone call I had placed to him on the evening I returned from Alaska. I had been the one to call. Elena filed the subpoena for the Lakewood Ridge HOA's internal records on October 29th, the same day she filed the legal action. The records arrived in her Raleigh office on November 8th. Board meeting minutes, financial records, contractor correspondence, and the internal communications related to the Harrow Lake Retreat project, going back to its first appearance on a board agenda. She called me the afternoon she read them. "Nate," they asked him, "tell me." The project appeared on the board agenda in March 2022. Garrison presented the full development concept: 199 cabins, the lodge, the boat launch, the dock system, projected revenue, construction timeline, the financial model. She paused. 3 board members asked specifically about the lake: who owned it, what the riparian rights instrument said, whether the lakebed owner had been contacted. I was quiet. At the March meeting, a board member named Teresa Wold asked, "Do we know who owns the lake itself? I want to make sure we've reviewed what we're actually authorized to do with the water." Garrison's response, as recorded in the minutes: "The water access rights run with the land. We have lake access. That's sufficient." He didn't answer the question. He redirected it. Teresa Wold's question was about ownership and the riparian rights instrument. His answer was about access rights, a different concept. She asked who owned the lake. He answered that they had access to it, and the board accepted that. At the March meeting, yes, the item was tabled for further review. Elena paused. At the June 2022 meeting, the second presentation, a board member named Carl Ostro asked again, directly, "Has anyone pulled the actual riparian rights instrument from the county recorder's office and read it? I want to see what it says before we approve a $12 million development." Garrison's response: "My attorney has reviewed the applicable water access rights. The project is legally sound." His attorney reviewed the access rights, I said, not the instrument. That's the distinction that matters, reviewing whether the HOA parcels carry riparian access rights. They do, Class B, is a different analysis from reading the 14-page instrument that defines what Class B rights authorize. His attorney confirmed the access rights existed. Whether anyone read pages 4 through 7, where the restrictions live, is a question his attorney is going to have to answer. A third board member, a man named Roger Falk, had asked at the June meeting whether the lakebed owner had been notified of the project and given an opportunity to review the development plans. Garrison's response: "The lakebed owner's consent is not required for improvements to HOA land. The cabins and lodge are on our property." Roger Falk: "What about the boat launch? That goes into the lake." Garrison: "That's a minimal infrastructure improvement consistent with our access rights." The board had voted 4-2 to approve the project. Teresa Wald and Roger Falk had voted no. Elena read me both dissenting votes from the minutes. Teresa Wald's recorded dissent. I'm voting no because I don't believe we've adequately resolved the water rights question. Roger Falk's. I'm voting no because the lakebed owner hasn't been contacted, and I think he should be. 2 board members had said, in a recorded vote, that the lakebed owner should be contacted. Garrison had not contacted me. He had broken ground in September 2022, 1 month after the board vote. He had opened the resort in February of this year. He had operated for 8 months, generating revenue at a rate of $1.2 million per month from commercial use of a lake he had assumed he was authorized to use because he had never read the 14 pages that said he wasn't. Teresa Wald and Roger Falk, I said. Are they still on the board? Teresa resigned in December 2022, 3 months after construction began. Her resignation letter is in the file. She cited unresolved legal questions regarding the lake access authorization as her reason. Elena paused. Roger Falk is still on the board. He called my office this morning. What did he say? He said he voted no in June 2022 because he thought someone should call you. He said he's been saying someone should call you for 2 years. A pause. He wants to cooperate. I looked out the western window at Lake Harrow. The late October light flat on the water, the eastern shore visible across the 340 acres, the cabin roof lines above the cleared buffer zone, the dock system along the water, the lodge at the center of it, built on my lake, built without asking. Tell Roger Falk, I said, that his instinct in June 2022 was correct. Elena filed on October 29th. 3 simultaneous actions, structured to work in parallel, each one targeting a different legal dimension of what Garrison had built, each one designed to produce consequences on a different timeline. The civil injunction would move at court speed. The state enforcement would move at agency speed. The lakebed trespass claim would move at the pace of a property dispute, with a documented survey and a clean chain of title. Together they would move faster than Garrison's attorney could respond to any one of them. The Superior Court filing sought preliminary injunctive relief under North Carolina's riparian rights doctrine, immediate cessation of commercial use of Lake Harrow as an amenity, marketed or actual, in connection with the Harrow Lake Retreat vacation rental operation. The legal standard for a preliminary injunction requires the moving party to show likelihood of success on the merits, irreparable harm absent the injunction, and a balance of equities favoring relief. Elena's brief addressed all 3 in sequence, and with the specific confidence of an attorney who has read the governing document and knows exactly what it says. Likelihood of success. The non-commercial clause in Section 2, subsection B, was unambiguous. The resort was generating revenue from lake access. The Class B rights instrument prohibited it. The legal analysis was not complex. Irreparable harm. Every day the resort operated on a commercial basis, revenue was generated from unauthorized use of Nate's property rights. That revenue, once generated, could not be fully remediated through subsequent damages. Guests who had already stayed, bookings already completed, the commercial reputation of the resort already built on the lake access representation. The harm was ongoing and accumulating daily. Balance of equities. Garrison had built a $12 million resort on rights he had misread. Nate had owned the lake since 2019 and had never been contacted. The equities did not balance in Garrison's favor. The state filing with the NC Division of Water Resources cited 2 independent grounds for emergency enforcement action. The first, the unpermitted stormwater discharge pipe, discharging 8 months of unfiltered construction and parking lot runoff into a privately owned lake without a state permit, without a county permit, and without the lakebed owner's consent. The state lab results had arrived on October 27th, 2 days before the filing. The results were what David Core's field readings had suggested they would be: elevated total suspended solids, elevated nitrogen and phosphorus levels consistent with fertilizer and construction runoff, fecal coliform counts at the outlet zone, exceeding state water quality standards for recreational waters by a factor of 3.4. 8 months of that pipe had been measurably degrading the water quality of my lake. The second, the unpermitted dock system. 340 linear feet, 44 lakebed penetrations, no state navigational obstruction permit, no lakebed owner consent. A permit application, filed belatedly by Garrison's attorney on October 27th, 2 days after Elena had given Caro the filing date and 2 days before she filed, was noted in the enforcement submission. Elena flagged the timing of the application in her cover letter. The application had been filed in response to the litigation threat, not in good faith compliance with the permitting requirement that had existed since the dock system was installed in January. The lakebed trespass claim was the third filing, a civil action in Superior Court separate from the injunction proceeding, asserting Nate Calloway's property rights in the lakebed against the concrete boat launch and the 44 dock anchor penetrations as permanent encroachments on titled private property. David Core's hydrographic survey was attached as the primary evidence exhibit. 847 square feet of concrete on Nate's lakebed, 44 steel pins in Nate's lakebed substrate, documented, measured, geolocated. The NC Division of Water Resources acted within 10 days. The notice of violation was issued on November 7th, addressed to the Lakewood Ridge Community Association and Garrison Priel personally. The notice cited both enforcement grounds from Elena's submission and added a third the agency had identified independently during their site inspection on November 3rd. The riparian buffer clearing along 2,100 linear feet of shoreline had removed established vegetation within a state-protected buffer zone, triggering a separate violation under the NC Riparian Buffer Protection Rules. 3 violations, 1 notice. The immediate compliance order. The stormwater discharge pipe was to be plugged within 72 hours. Not redirected, not filtered, plugged, pending the design and installation of a compliant stormwater management system that would need to be engineered, permitted, and approved before any discharge into the lake could resume. Garrison's contractor plugged the pipe on November 9th. The dock system permit application, filed October 27th, before Elena's filing date, but after Caro had received the 10-day remediation deadline, was reviewed by the division's permits office and denied on November 12th. The denial letter cited one ground. The application lacked the written consent of the lakebed owner of record, which the navigational obstruction permitting process required before a permit could be issued for a dock system of this size on a privately owned water body. Lakebed owner consent was mine to give. Philip Caro called Elena on November 12th, the same afternoon the permit denial arrived. "We need the consent document," he said. "The dock system is a $340,000 installation. My client needs the permit." "Your client needs my client's consent," Elena said. "My client hasn't decided whether to give it." "What would it take?" "Philip, your client built a 340 linear foot commercial dock system on my client's lakebed without asking. The consent question is part of the broader resolution. It doesn't get resolved separately." Caro understood what she was telling him. The dock system, $340,000 of installed infrastructure, was sitting on my lakebed without a permit, with a denied permit application, and with no path to a permit that didn't run through my consent. It could not legally remain where it was. It could not be permitted where it was without me, and I had not decided to help. Judge Eleanor Voss granted the preliminary injunction on November 14th. The hearing had lasted 90 minutes. Philip Caro had argued that the non-commercial clause was subject to reasonable interpretation. The same argument he had made to Elena in October, expanded into a brief and presented with the professional thoroughness of an attorney who knew the argument was weak, but had an obligation to make it. He argued that the HOA's members were residential homeowners, not commercial guests, and that the resort's operation should be understood as an extension of residential recreational use, rather than a separate commercial enterprise. Judge Voss had read the instrument before the hearing. Her questions during argument made that clear. She cited section numbers without referring to her copy. She asked Caro specifically about the phrase revenue-generating use in Section 2, subsection B, and she asked Elena whether Harold Greer's 1987 intent could be discerned from the instrument structure. Elena's answer: "Your Honor, Harold Greer listed specific prohibited activities in Section 3, commercial boat launches, commercial dock facilities, constructed access infrastructure. He defined non-commercial in Section 2 by explicit exclusion of revenue-generating use. The instrument is not ambiguous. It was written by someone who anticipated exactly the kind of development the defendant has built and wrote language specifically designed to prohibit it." Judge Voss ruled from the bench. The preliminary injunction was granted, effective immediately. No vacation rental activity at Harrow Lake Retreat could involve any representation of lake access, lake views, or lake proximity as a commercial amenity or as a feature of the guest experience. No marketing materials, booking platform listings, website content, or guest communications could reference the lake in connection with a commercial transaction. No fee-based water activities, kayak rentals, fishing services, guided lake tours could operate. The dock system, pending the permit resolution, could not be used for commercial guest activity. The order was specific because Elena had drafted the proposed order with specificity. She had anticipated what Garrison's team might argue was permitted within a broad injunction, and had closed each gap in the proposed language. Garrison's marketing department spent the evening of November 14th pulling lake references from 199 booking platform listings. The listings that remained described cabins in a wooded development in the North Carolina Piedmont. No lake, no water access, no kayaks, no fishing, no lakefront experience. The bookings collapsed overnight. Elena's assistant monitored the booking platform on November 15th and 16th. The cancellation rate in the 48 hours after the injunction was 71% of forward bookings. Guests who had booked specifically on the lake access amenity, which was most of them, because the lake access amenity was why Garrison had built 199 cabins in this particular location, were canceling at a rate that represented, by Elena's estimate, approximately $3.2 million in forward booking revenue evaporating in 2 days. 199 cabins marketed on lake access. Without the lake, they were 199 cabins in the woods. Garrison came to my door on the evening of November 17th, 3 days after the injunction. He drove himself. No attorney, no assistant, just his own car in my driveway at 6:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, the lake visible behind the house in the failing November light. I had been expecting him, not on this specific evening, but I had known the injunction would bring him, and I had known he would come before his attorney told him to, because the financial pressure of a 71% cancellation rate and a $340,000 dock system sitting unpermitted on someone else's lake bed has a way of compressing the timeline between crisis and conversation. I answered the door. The man who had called me, a man with concerns about the development, 3 weeks ago, was not the man standing on my porch. That man had been composed, prepared, operating from a position of certainty about his legal footing. This man had the specific look of someone who has spent 72 hours watching his financial model disintegrate and has arrived at the only door that can stop it. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "I'd like to talk about a resolution." I looked at him. "Did you read the riparian rights instrument before you built 199 cabins on my lake?" He started. "My attorney, did you read it?" He stopped, held my gaze for a moment. He did not answer. I said, "Elena will send you the negotiation framework by Friday. You respond to her. Everything goes through her from this point." I closed the door. I went back to the kitchen table where Dana was sitting with the water quality report open in front of her. The state lab results, the fecal coliform numbers, the 8 months of discharge data. She looked up. "He came alone," she said. "I know. That means it's bad for him." I sat down and looked at the lake through the western window. November dark coming down across the water. The eastern shore lights visible. The lodge, the cabins, occupied at 29% of capacity now. The guests who hadn't canceled yet staying in woodland cabins that used to be lakefront cabins and would not be again until this was resolved. "It's been bad for him since October 29th, I said. "He's just now understanding how bad." Elena filed the criminal referral on November 21st. It went to 2 offices simultaneously, the Cabarrus County District Attorney and the North Carolina Attorney General's Environmental Enforcement Division. The dual filing was deliberate. The criminal dimensions of what Garrison had built split cleanly between local and state jurisdiction, and filing both at once compressed the response timeline and prevented either office from deferring to the other. The referral was 51 pages. David Core's hydrographic survey, the state lab water quality results, the chain of title documentation on Lake Harrow, the 1987 riparian rights instrument in full, with the relevant sections highlighted, the board meeting minutes showing the 3 questions about lake ownership and Garrison's responses, Teresa Wold's resignation letter, The HOA's financial records showing the $12 million construction investment and the 8 months of revenue generation. The booking platform data showing 199 cabins marketed on lake access at $285 per night. 4 charges sought. The first, lake bed trespass, permanent encroachment on titled private property without owner consent. The concrete boat launch, 847 square feet of poured concrete on Nate Calloway's lake bed. The dock anchors, 44 steel helical pins driven into Nate Calloway's lakebed substrate to an average depth of 4.2 feet. Both installations made without contact with the lakebed owner, without consent, without any attempt to establish authorization. The trespass was not accidental. It was designed, engineered, and constructed. Someone had measured the water depth at the eastern shore before they poured the launch. They had known they were building into the lake. They had not asked whose lake it was. The second, unpermitted discharge into state waters under North Carolina General Statute 143-215.1. The stormwater discharge pipe, 18 inches in diameter, outlet submerged 4 feet below the water surface, had been discharging unfiltered runoff from the resort's paved loop road, parking lot, and construction-disturbed surfaces directly into Lake Harrow for 8 months. No county permit, no state permit, no water quality review. The state lab results documented the consequence. Fecal coliform counts at the outlet zone 3.4 times the state recreational water standard. Elevated nitrogen and phosphorus levels, consistent with fertilizer and organic runoff. Elevated suspended solids throughout the outlet cove. North Carolina General Statute 143-215.1 prohibits the discharge of waste into state waters without a permit. A privately owned lake is state waters for purposes of the discharge statute. Private ownership of the lakebed does not remove the water from state water quality jurisdiction. The third, commercial use of restricted riparian rights, misrepresentation of property rights to obtain commercial revenue. Garrison had represented to his board, to his investors, to his construction contractors, and to the public through the resort's marketing materials, that the Lakewood Ridge HOA had the legal right to operate a commercial resort on Lake Harrow. That representation was false. The Class B riparian rights instrument prohibited commercial use without the lakebed owner's consent. The consent had never been sought. The representation had been made to obtain $12 million in construction financing, board approval, and $9.6 million in guest bookings. The fourth, consumer fraud, marketing lake access as a commercial amenity on property with restricted riparian rights. Every guest who had booked a cabin at Harrow Lake Retreat had done so under the representation that lake access was a feature of their stay. The booking platform listing for each of the 199 units had led with lake access as the primary amenity. The resort's website had described private lake access and an exclusive Lake Harrow experience. Guests had paid $285 per night, in part for access to a lake that the resort operator did not have the legal right to sell them access to. That was consumer fraud under North Carolina's Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Statute. The state lab's full water quality report arrived on November 19th, 2 days before the criminal referral, in time for Elena to attach it as Exhibit G. The Division of Water Resources had ordered the testing on November 3rd, the day of their site inspection, and had collected samples at 8 locations. The discharge pipe outlet, 3 points within 50 feet of the outlet, 2 mid-lake reference points, and 2 points on the western shore near our property. The western shore samples were the control, the water quality at the undisturbed shoreline, before any influence from the resort construction. The results told a clear story. At the outlet, and within the outlet cove, fecal coliform at 3.4 times the recreational standard. Total suspended solids elevated. Nitrogen and phosphorus levels consistent with fertilizer application runoff from the resort's landscaped cabin grounds. The outlet cove had measurably worse water quality than the rest of the lake. At the mid-lake reference points, the contamination had not yet dispersed to a measurable degree at the center of the 340-acre lake. The dilution volume had absorbed most of the impact at distance, but the trajectory over time, absent remediation, was not favorable. A 340-acre lake receiving 8 months of nutrient loading from an 18-inch discharge pipe would show cumulative degradation. The division's report included a modeling projection. At the documented discharge rate, the mid-lake nitrogen and phosphorus levels would reach measurable elevation within 18 to 24 months of continued discharge. The pipe had been plugged on November 9th. The discharge had stopped. The damage to the outlet cove had not stopped. The environmental remediation order from the Division of Water Resources was issued on November 18th and was comprehensive. Full water quality assessment of Lake Harrow, baseline documentation of current conditions, and a monitoring program extending 36 months to track recovery. Cost, approximately $180,000. Riparian buffer restoration along the full 2,100 linear feet of disturbed eastern and northern shoreline. Removal of impervious surfaces within the buffer zone where physically possible. Native vegetation replanting. Engineered grade restoration to re-establish the natural filtration function the cleared buffer had provided. Cost estimate from the division's environmental contractor, $1.4 million. Engineered stormwater management system, design, permitting, and installation of a compliant stormwater collection and treatment system serving the resort's 199 cabin units, the lodge, and the loop road before any stormwater could be discharged to the lake or adjacent waterways. Cost estimate, $520,000. Total environmental remediation cost, $2.1 million. Garrison Priel's responsibility. The Lakewood Ridge Community Association's responsibility. The division's order named both. Philip Caro called Elena the morning the remediation order arrived. She let it go to voicemail. The civil suit had been filed in Superior Court on October 29th, alongside the injunction motion. The full damages claim structured and documented before Elena filed anything, so that the legal action arrived as a complete picture rather than a preliminary filing that the defense could characterize as exploratory. The demand, lakebed encroachment damages, the concrete boat launch and the dock anchor system. The fair market value of 847 square feet of lakebed encroachment, calculated at the assessed lakebed value plus the commercial use premium applicable to a resort-adjacent water body, plus the cost of full physical removal and lakebed restoration, $380,000. Riparian buffer restoration, the full $2.1 million remediation cost from the Division of Water Resources order. This was not a speculative damage figure. It was a state agency's documented assessment of the cost to restore what Garrison had destroyed. Commercial use of restricted riparian rights, unjust enrichment. 8 months of commercial resort operation, generating revenue from lake access that the Class B instrument prohibited without lakebed owner consent. The unjust enrichment claim sought the disgorgement of the profit attributable to the lake access component of the resort's revenue, not the full $9.6 million gross, but the portion attributable to the unauthorized use of my property rights. Elena's damages expert had calculated the lake access premium at approximately 65% of the nightly rate, the difference between what guests would pay for a woodland cabin without lake access and what they had paid for a lakefront cabin with it. The unjust enrichment figure, $9.6 million. Punitive damages, $19.2 million, twice the unjust enrichment figure, the standard punitive multiplier in North Carolina's willful property rights cases. The willfulness predicate was built from 5 documented facts: the board members who had asked about lake ownership and been told the question was resolved, Teresa Wold's resignation letter naming the unresolved water rights question as her reason for leaving, Roger Falk's recorded no vote and his stated reason. The lakebed owner should be contacted, the 2-year gap between the board approval and the first contact with me, and the specific engineering of the boat launch, the 2-phase pour designed for the lake's depth profile. That demonstrated knowledge that the construction was going into the lake before the first yard of concrete was mixed. Total civil demand, $31.28 million plus attorney fees. Roger Falk had been on the Lakewood Ridge HOA board since 2020. He had voted no in June 2022 because he thought someone should call the man who owned the lake. He had been outvoted 4-2. He had remained on the board because he believed, as he told Elena when she met with him on November 10th, that his presence was more useful than his absence, that at least one person on the board knew the water rights question had never been resolved, and was watching for the moment when that would matter. The moment had arrived. Roger provided Elena with everything she asked for: his personal notes from both the March and June 2022 board meetings, the emails he had sent to Garrison in July 2022 asking whether the lakebed owner had been contacted, emails Garrison had not responded to, and the communications he had exchanged with Teresa Wold in the months after her resignation, in which she had expressed continued concern about the project's legal foundation. Teresa Wold had left Lakewood Ridge in early 2023, sold her HOA property, and moved to Asheville. In part, she had told Roger, because she didn't want to be present when the water rights problem surfaced. She had known it would surface. She had not known when. She returned Elena's call on November 15th. "I asked him twice," she said. "Who owns the lake? What does the instrument say? Did you call the owner? He told me the water access rights were sufficient. I knew that wasn't an answer. I voted no, and then I resigned because I wasn't going to put my name on a board that was building a commercial resort on someone else's lake." "Ms. Wold," Elena said, "would you be willing to provide a declaration attesting to what you've just described?" A pause. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me that question for 2 years, Teresa said. The board had been told. The question had been asked. Garrison had redirected it, deflected it, and overridden the 2 people who had pushed for an answer. He had built $12 million worth of resort infrastructure on an assumption he had never verified. He had assumed lake access meant lake ownership. It did not. And now the full accounting had arrived. The state, the county, the Superior Court, and a water rights attorney who had written instruments like the one on page 4 since before Garrison Priel had ever looked at Lake Harrow and seen a resort asset. Philip Caro called Elena on December 3rd. He had waited 2 weeks after the criminal referral before calling, long enough, Elena suspected, to have a full conversation with Garrison about the financial reality of what the referral meant on top of the injunction, the state enforcement order, and the civil filing. Long enough for Garrison to look at the forward booking collapse, the $2.1 million environmental remediation order, and the $31.28 million civil demand, and arrive at the arithmetic that his attorney had probably been presenting to him since October 29th. "My client wants to negotiate," Caro said. "My client is open to a resolution," Elena said. "Send me an opening proposal by Friday." The proposal arrived Friday afternoon. It was, as opening proposals in cases of this magnitude tend to be, a document designed to establish a floor rather than reflect a genuine assessment of the case value. Caro had offered $8.4 million in total settlement, a number that bore a specific relationship to Garrison's projected insurance coverage and very little relationship to the documented damages. Elena forwarded it to me with a one-line note. "This is their opening, not their position." I wrote back, "I know, proceed." The negotiation ran 6 weeks. Caro and Elena exchanged proposals every 5 to 7 days, each exchange moving the number in the direction the evidence pointed, which was up. The criminal referral gave Elena leverage that pure civil litigation doesn't always provide. Every week the DA's office held the referral without declining was a week Garrison's exposure included the possibility of criminal charges alongside the civil judgment. Caro was managing 2 clocks simultaneously, and Elena knew it. The environmental remediation figures were non-negotiable from the beginning. The Division of Water Resources order had established the $2.1 million cost through independent agency assessment, and no court was going to accept a settlement that left the lake's restoration underfunded. Caro accepted that early. The negotiation was really about 3 numbers: the lakebed encroachment damages, the unjust enrichment figure, and the punitive component. On the unjust enrichment figure, Elena held firm on the 65% lake access premium calculation. Caro argued for a lower premium, 40%, which would have reduced the unjust enrichment figure by approximately $2.3 million. Elena's response was the booking data. After the injunction removed the lake access representation from the listings, the forward cancellation rate had been 71%. Guests were not paying $285 per night for a woodland cabin. They were paying it for the lake. The 65% premium was conservative. Caro accepted 60%. The punitive component was the last number to settle. Elena had demanded $19.2 million. Caro's final offer was $7.8 million. They settled at $8.5 million, a figure that reflected the documented willfulness without reaching the full multiplier, and that Garrison's litigation insurer had apparently indicated was within the range they would contribute to. The final settlement agreement was signed on January 14th. Full removal of the concrete boat launch and the dock system at Garrison's expense. A demolition and marine salvage contractor retained by the HOA under Elena's supervision to break up the concrete launch and extract the 44 dock anchor pins from my lake bed. Estimated cost, $890,000. Garrison's cost, riparian buffer restoration along the full 2,100 linear feet of disturbed eastern and northern shoreline, native vegetation replanting, grade restoration, removal of impervious surfaces within the buffer zone. The Division of Water Resources approved restoration plan, executed by their selected environmental contractor. Cost, $2.1 million. Garrison's cost, water quality remediation, the monitoring program, the Outlet Cove remediation, the long-term assessment protocol. Cost, $1.4 million. Garrison's cost, commercial use damages and unjust enrichment, 8 months of resort revenue attributable to the unauthorized lake access amenity at the negotiated 60% premium, $11.2 million. Punitive component, $8.5 million. Total settlement, $24.09 million. The settlement agreement included one additional provision that Elena had insisted on and that Caro had accepted after minimal resistance. A permanent recorded covenant on the Lakewood Ridge shoreline parcels, filed with the county, acknowledging the Class B riparian rights limitations, and specifically prohibiting any future commercial use of lake access without the written consent of the lakebed owner of record. The instrument that Harold Greer had written in 1987 already said this. The covenant said it again in 2026, in language that referenced the settlement and could not be characterized as ambiguous by any future developer who looked at the eastern shore of Lake Harrow and saw a resort asset. The Lakewood Ridge HOA membership called an emergency meeting in December, while the settlement was still being negotiated, and voted to remove Garrison Priel from the presidency. The vote was 112 to 8. The 112 homeowners who voted to remove him were not, primarily, people who objected to the resort concept on principle. They were people who had bought property in a development that had marketed itself as a lakefront community, had paid lakefront prices for their lots, and were now looking at the financial and legal consequences of a president who had built a $12 million resort on water rights he had never fully read. The vacation rental project had no commercial future. The injunction remained in place pending the settlement's final execution, and even after execution, the restored covenant made clear that commercial lake access required lakebed owner consent, my consent. I had not offered it and had no current intention of offering it on terms that made Garrison's resort model viable. Without the lake, 199 prefabricated cabins in a Piedmont, Carolina development had the commercial appeal of 199 prefabricated cabins in a Piedmont, Carolina development. The booking platform algorithm understood this. The post-injunction occupancy rate, the guests who stayed through the fall without the lake representation, had been 22%. At 22% occupancy, $285 per night, the resort covered its operating costs and nothing else. The cabins remained standing on the eastern shore. They would be there for years. Probably, the cost of removing prefab construction is real, and Garrison's financial position after a $24 million settlement did not suggest surplus capital for demolition. They stood in the tree line visible from my western shore, empty now in the January light, the resort infrastructure without the resort purpose. The Lakewood Ridge homeowners who had bought lots in the development after 2022, after the resort opened, after the lake access marketing had driven lot prices up, held property whose value had been built on an amenity that no longer existed. The property values in the development had dropped, not collapsed. The lots were still lakefront adjacent, still in a maintained HOA community, but the premium that lake access had commanded was gone. They had paid for a lake they didn't own. Garrison had sold them something that wasn't his to sell. The DA filed charges in January. Not the full referral. The criminal process works through its own evaluation, and the DA had reviewed the 4-count referral and made charging decisions based on the provability standard that criminal cases require. One charge filed: unpermitted discharge into state waters, a criminal misdemeanor under NC General Statute 143-215.1. The stormwater pipe was the cleanest count. Physical evidence, state lab results, a clear statutory prohibition, and no ambiguity about whether Garrison had known the pipe was discharging into the lake. He had approved the construction plans. The pipe was on the plans. The other three counts, lake bed trespass, commercial use misrepresentation, and consumer fraud, were referred to the civil process and the Attorney General's separate enforcement action. The DA had determined that the civil remedies were adequate for those counts, and that the criminal resources were better applied where the physical environmental harm was clearest. Garrison pleaded guilty to the misdemeanor discharge charge in February. Sentence: $45,000 fine, 2 years probation, and mandatory completion of a state-certified environmental compliance training program. The specific program the NC Department of Environmental Quality required for developers with environmental violations on their record before they could receive state permits for future projects. The fine was, in the context of a $24 million settlement, a rounding error. The probation and the compliance requirement were the consequence that had teeth. Garrison was a developer. His business model required state permits. The violation on his record and the compliance requirement preceding any future permit application was not a minor inconvenience. The Attorney General's consumer fraud enforcement action moved separately and on its own timeline. The AG's office had opened the investigation in November after Elena's referral and had issued civil investigative demands to the resort's booking platform for guest booking data. The investigation's conclusion, announced in March, required Harrow Lake Retreat to provide full refunds to any guest who had booked specifically on the lake access representation and whose stay had occurred after the injunction removed lake access from the amenity list. The refund pool, approximately $1.8 million, processed through a claims administrator over 6 months. Guests who had paid for a lake they had no right to be sold got their money back. The marine salvage contractor arrived on March 3rd. I was at the water's edge when the barge came around the northern curve of the lake, a flat-deck work platform with a crane unit and a 4-person crew, moving slowly down the eastern shore to the boat launch position. Dana was beside me. The early morning light was flat and gray, the lake surface still, the eastern shore visible across the water, with the restoration crew's equipment already staged along the buffer zone. The native vegetation pallets, the grading equipment, the silt fence running along the cleared shoreline edge. The barge anchored at the launch position at 7:40 a.m. The concrete braking started at 8:15. I could hear it across the water, the hydraulic hammer, the specific sound of concrete fracturing, the pauses between strikes as the crew cleared debris. The launch had been built in 2 phases. It came out in pieces, the submerged section lifted by the crane in slabs. Each slab swung to the barge deck and stacked for hauling. The dock anchor extraction took most of the afternoon. The helical pins required a hydraulic extraction tool, a torque drive that reversed the installation rotation and pulled each pin from the lakebed substrate. 44 extractions. The crew chief had told Elena it would take 5 to 6 hours. It took 7, because 3 of the pins had been set deeper than the installation drawing showed, and required a second extraction pass. At 4:47 p.m., the crew chief called the last pin clear. My lake bed had 44 fewer intrusions than it had had at 8 a.m. Dana and I stood at the water's edge as the barge moved back up the eastern shore toward the dock staging area. 199 cabins, Dana said. She was looking at the eastern shore, the cabin roof lines visible above the buffer zone restoration crew's work line, the structures still standing, still there, just emptied now of the commercial life that had briefly animated them. He built 199 cabins. On my lake, I said. We stood there for a while. The restoration crew was still working along the shore, the native planting teams moving in behind the grading equipment, setting root balls into the restored grade, the first line of buffer vegetation going back into ground that had been cleared for 2 years. Dana, what made you sure you had him? I looked at the water, the surface undisturbed now, the dock gone, the launch gone, the lake bed beneath it, 340 acres of titled private property the way it had been since 2019, and the way it had been under the Greer Family Trust since 1987. He built a commercial resort on restricted riparian access rights, I said, and he never read the instrument that restricted them. A beat. I wrote instruments like that one for 14 years. I know what they say. Every clause, every defined term, every specific prohibition. Harold Greer wrote page 4 to prevent exactly what Garrison built. I looked at the far shore. The 199 cabins through the tree line, still standing, empty. He assumed lake access meant lake ownership, I said. It never did. It just looked that way from the shoreline if you didn't read the document. Dana was quiet. The last of the afternoon light went off the water. The restoration crew's equipment fell silent as the workday ended. The first 200 feet of buffer planting done, the native vegetation in the ground along a shoreline that had been stripped and graded and paved for 2 years. You can build whatever you want on your land, I said. I looked at the lake. You can't build a business on mine.